For decades, Washington treated India as a loyal partner, a democracy that stood shoulder to shoulder with the West against China. But that illusion just shattered. In a move that sent shockwaves through every financial market on the planet, Prime Minister Narendra Modi effectively froze the dominance of the US dollar inside India's trade system. And he did it right after Donald Trump tried to weaponize tariffs once again. The message was clear: India will not bow. From Washington to Wall Street, disbelief turned into panic. Beijing, on the other hand, was smiling. Because while America kept raising tariffs, India quietly began rewriting the rules of global power, linking arms with China, rebuilding its industries, and preparing for a future where the dollar is no longer king. This is not just another trade disagreement. This is the beginning of a tectonic shift, one that could redefine the balance of power between East and West. Tonight on Cross-Border News, we dive into how Modi's defiance, Trump's tariffs, and Beijing's strategy combined to create a moment no one thought possible. India turning its back on the US dollar. It all started with a decision that looked like just another headline in Trump's never-ending tariff battles. But this time, the shockwaves reached far beyond Beijing. When Trump announced a 100% tariff on Chinese goods in retaliation for China's rare earth export restrictions, he expected to pressure Beijing. Instead, he triggered a ripple effect that slammed straight into India's economy. For years, India had walked a tightrope, trading with both the US and China, keeping one foot in Washington's world of finance and the other in Asia's industrial network. But the new tariffs disrupted that fragile balance overnight. India's manufacturers, dependent on Chinese components and American buyers, were suddenly trapped in the crossfire of a trade war they never started. Prime Minister Narendra Modi didn't hide his anger. At a press conference, he called the tariffs a weapon that benefits no one and warned that such measures could destabilize the global economy. Then came a quiet but powerful move. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, Modi held closed-door meetings with senior Chinese officials, signaling a subtle but unmistakable shift. Analysts in Washington took notice. What they once dismissed as non-alignment now looked like a real pivot. For the first time, India wasn't acting as America's backup plan in Asia, it was setting its own course. When Trump heard Modi's public criticism, insiders say he called it a betrayal. But Modi wasn't bluffing. He was laying the groundwork for something much bigger: economic independence from the United States. And as Washington debated its next move, Modi's government was already planning a counterstroke, one that would challenge America's dominance in trade, technology, and even currency. The era of India quietly complying with US demands had just come to an end. By mid-May 2025, the situation exploded. After weeks of diplomatic silence, Trump signed a sweeping executive order slapping 25% tariffs on Indian exports, from steel and textiles to pharmaceuticals and auto parts. He claimed it was about fairness, accusing India of exploiting US markets while cozying up to Russia and China. But in New Delhi, it felt like a personal attack. Factories that once shipped billions in goods to America suddenly found their orders canceled. Small exporters saw their profits vanish overnight. The Indian rupee trembled, investors panicked, and frustration grew across every industrial hub from Mumbai to Chennai. Modi's government was cornered, but instead of pleading for relief, it struck back in silence. India quietly began easing restrictions on Chinese imports, letting in the very goods Washington had tried to choke off. From rare earth elements to microchips and electronics, Chinese components started flooding Indian markets. Officially, it was about stabilizing supply chains. In reality, it was Modi's message to Washington: India will not kneel. Within months, China became India's fastest-growing trade partner. Beijing offered new contracts, investment guarantees, and technology sharing, all without political strings. Indian industry responded immediately, shifting production toward the east. American think tanks warned that India was sliding toward Beijing's orbit. But for Modi, it wasn't submission, it was survival. And as India's economy adapted, Washington's leverage began to crumble. The US could no longer dictate terms, because the world's fifth-largest economy had found an alternative lifeline, one made in China. The rebellion was quiet, calculated, and entirely deliberate. And behind closed doors in Delhi, officials were drafting the blueprint for something even bolder: a rare earth alliance with China that would shake the foundation of America's global strategy. Rare earth elements, the silent force behind smartphones, fighter jets, and electric vehicles, have become the currency of modern power. For decades, Washington believed it could use India as a counterweight to China's monopoly over these critical minerals. But in 2025, that illusion vanished overnight. When the Economic Times published a stunning headline, "Rare Earth Common Ground, India and China Unite for Strategic Cooperation," the world understood something had shifted. Modi's government had signed a deal that gave Chinese companies direct access to invest in India's rare earth mining and processing sectors, while India received advanced technology, equipment, and joint research funding in return. On paper, it was about industrial development. In reality, it was a geopolitical earthquake. By joining hands with Beijing, India wasn't just securing resources, it was helping China consolidate control over the world's most vital supply chain. Washington reacted with disbelief. The Pentagon had long counted on India as the democratic alternative to China's dominance in rare earths. Now that hope was gone. U.S. analysts warned that if India and China collaborated on resource extraction, America would lose its strategic advantage, both in production capacity and technological know-how. But for Modi, this wasn't betrayal. It was economic realism. India needed access to rare earth processing to fuel its electric vehicle revolution, defense manufacturing, and semiconductor push, and only China had the infrastructure to make it happen. The partnership wasn't just about minerals, it was about power. Two of Asia's largest economies were aligning their industrial futures, leaving Washington isolated. And as Beijing celebrated the deal in its state media, one headline summed it up perfectly. India has joined the new industrial order, one that no longer answers to the West. In Washington, disbelief quickly turned into panic. The news of India's rare earth alliance with China sent tremors through the National Security Council. Overnight, India had gone from being America's strategic partner to what one senior advisor called a wildcard with nuclear leverage. Trump, furious at what he saw as betrayal, reportedly slammed his desk and ordered his team to bring Delhi back in line. But behind the tough talk, the White House knew the damage was done. A new containment strategy was drafted: fresh tariffs, export bans on defense technology, and diplomatic pressure through allies like Japan and Australia. But India didn't blink. Modi ignored Washington's warnings, refusing even to attend a joint Indo-Pacific defense summit. The message was clear: India was done taking orders. Think tanks sounded the alarm. The Atlantic Council issued a report bluntly titled "India is no longer an ally." It warned that New Delhi's economic independence and growing ties with Beijing had dismantled 2 decades of U.S. Indo-Pacific policy. For the Pentagon, this was a nightmare scenario. India had been the cornerstone of America's plan to contain China, and now that cornerstone had crumbled. Meanwhile, major U.S. corporations, from Apple to Pfizer, froze expansion projects in India, fearing retaliation or new trade restrictions. Yet on the ground in Delhi, the mood was defiant. Modi's approval ratings soared. To the Indian public, this wasn't isolation. It was liberation, proof that their country could stand on its own. And while Trump's advisors debated how to punish India, Beijing and Delhi were already preparing their next move, one that would hit Washington where it hurt most. Global finance, because the next battlefield wasn't trade, it was the dollar itself. By late summer, the global map was changing in real time. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, India crossed a line it had spent decades tiptoeing around. In a closed-door session, Modi signed onto a sweeping framework that officially tied India's economic future to a new continental alliance, one led by China, Russia, and Iran. This was the birth of what analysts now call the New Asian Axis. The deal linked everything the West feared: Russian oil, Iranian ports, Chinese technology, and Indian manpower, a supply chain stretching from the Arctic to the Arabian Sea. Russia promised long-term crude at deep discounts. Iran opened expanded access to the Chabahar port, bypassing U.S.-controlled shipping lanes. And China pledged tens of billions in green tech investments for India's industrial zones. It was a direct answer to Washington's sanctions and tariffs, a self-sufficient system immune to Western interference. For the Pentagon, this was a nightmare coming true. The country once envisioned as a democratic bulwark against China was now sitting beside Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow, shaping a world order built to survive without America. In Delhi, the move was framed as strategic autonomy. But behind the diplomatic language, the message was unmistakable. India was no longer the West's junior partner, it was the East's newest pillar. Photos leaked of Indian and Chinese troops conducting joint patrols in the Ladakh region, the same mountains where they once clashed. To Western observers, it was stunning. To Asia, it was symbolic proof that even old rivals could unite when the U.S. overreached. And for Washington, that image said it all. The world's largest democracy had officially joined a bloc built to end American dominance. Beijing could barely contain its satisfaction. The same China that once saw India as a regional rival was now celebrating Modi as a statesman who had resisted Western coercion and reclaimed Asian dignity. Chinese state media launched a full-scale narrative campaign painting India as a partner in a new fair global order. The Global Times called Modi a visionary unshackling Asia from Western dictates. while Xinhua proudly declared that the age of dollar obedience is over. For Washington, it was humiliating. For Beijing, it was theater, the kind of propaganda victory money couldn't buy. After decades of portraying itself as the alternative to U.S. hegemony, China had found the perfect symbol, a democratic powerhouse standing proudly beside it. Inside the White House, reports from Politico described total disbelief. Trump's advisors scrambled to organize G7 crisis consultations, warning that the Indo-Chinese alignment could rewrite global trade patterns within a year. One official even admitted, losing India isn't a setback, it's a strategic collapse. Meanwhile, the money told its own story. Chinese capital flooded into India's infrastructure projects, logistics networks, and tech manufacturing. Industrial parks in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu saw joint Indo-Chinese construction crews breaking ground on massive new facilities. Western investors, frightened by uncertainty, were pulling out, leaving the field open for Asia's emerging superpowers. Beijing's diplomats were gleeful. "We don't need to fight America," one official told Cakeson. "America is defeating itself." And in many ways, he was right. Every sanction, every tariff, every threat had only pushed India further away. Washington thought it could isolate Beijing. Instead, it isolated itself. And the next front in this quiet war wasn't industrial or military, it was financial. The target, the US dollar itself. The real shock came not from trade or diplomacy, but from a single meeting that took place far from Western eyes. In September, high-level officials from India, China, and Russia gathered behind closed doors to discuss a project that could redefine global finance, a dollar-independent settlement system. According to leaks from Nikkei Asia, the goal was simple but revolutionary: to create a payment network for energy, minerals, and manufacturing that completely bypassed the US currency. For decades, Washington's greatest weapon wasn't its military, it was the dollar. Every oil deal, every global bank transaction, every trade agreement was chained to it. But now, the three biggest economies outside the West were building a financial world where the dollar simply didn't matter. Bloomberg later confirmed that Indian officials referred to it privately as the end of American monopoly. Beijing offered India a key role in its digital yuan project, allowing settlements for crude oil and rare earths through a new Asian digital ledger. Russia quickly backed it, proposing a shared reserve mechanism to stabilize exchange rates across the bloc. In Washington, panic erupted. Economists warned of a fragmented financial order. The Treasury Department called it a direct threat to U.S. economic leadership. But for Modi, it was the logical next step, a way to secure India's future without depending on a currency that Washington could weaponize at any time. American corporations began retreating from India, shifting investments to Vietnam and Indonesia. Yet, Asian investors filled the gap instantly. The East was no longer waiting for permission. For the first time in modern history, the US dollar faced organized resistance, not from one enemy, but from a coalition of nations once considered allies. And at the center of it all stood India. For decades, Washington believed that India's partnership was permanent, that shared democracy and defense deals would keep New Delhi tethered to the West. But 2025 shattered that illusion. One tariff at a time, the United States pushed India into the arms of its greatest rival. And when Modi finally decided to move, he didn't just retaliate, he rewrote the rules of global power. Trump's economic warfare backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing India to yield, it ignited a wave of defiance across Asia. Modi saw what few Western leaders dared to admit, that the world was tired of living under the dollar's thumb. So he built something new, a sovereign path powered by Asian capital, Eastern technology, and Indian ambition. Now, the once loyal ally of the US stands as the fourth pillar of a new world order, alongside China, Russia, and Iran. Trade routes are shifting east, currencies are breaking free from the dollar, and Washington's dominance is fading faster than anyone imagined. Inside the White House, advisors call it a strategic loss. But on the streets of Delhi, it's seen as independence, the moment India stopped following and started leading. And perhaps that's the real story here. The US didn't lose India because of ideology or diplomacy. It lost India because it underestimated its pride. As the global economy realigns and the East rises, one truth now echoes from Beijing to New Delhi: the era of American control is ending. The dollar, once untouchable, now stands on shaky ground. And for the first time in modern history, the balance of power doesn't orbit Washington anymore. It's shifting eastward, toward nations that no longer need permission to lead. This is cross-border news, revealing how the world is changing, one power shift at a time.